Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zvachim Daf Kuf Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Anne Rubin in loving memory of Sue Moses. To my dear friend, the sister I chose for 66 years. She left this earth too quickly and too early, and I will carry her in my heart and miss her every day. Today's daf is sponsored by Tracy Ackner in honor of Gilan. We first learned together more than 30 years ago, and I hope we will still be learning together in 30 years. Today's daf is sponsored by Osnat Klein in loving memory of Shmuel ben Yosef. Okay, a few announcements. So we sent out yesterday the information about the bakery of the Beit HaMikdash. We're going to invite you all to a workshop. If you're not in Israel, if you can't make it, first of all, maybe we'll have an alternative date. We'll work on that after the first, we go through the first set. Okay, there's an English one on January 19th. There's a Hebrew one on the 26th. We're going to open registration on Sunday at 5 p.m. Israel time. Okay, so the form will open then. If you try to go into the form before, it will not be open. It will be open at 5 p.m. on Sunday, and then you can register. First come, first serve. There's 25 spots, and your spot will be reserved when you pay. That's first of all. It's for pay. It doesn't go to Hadron. It goes straight to the bakery of the Beit Mikdash. It's a great opportunity for anyone who's interested. First of all, the link is there. You can read up about it. We're basically going to bake the minachot and cook. There's different ways they did. They boiled. They this. We're going to learn how they did it and actually do it. Don't get too excited. The bread's not delicious tasting, but it is interesting to see. So while it is a baking activity, I wouldn't exactly qualify it as a delicious baking activity. But it really, you get to visualize and see how they do it, and it's amazing. So if you are visiting Israel at some other point, you can just go there anytime you want on your own. We're just doing this Sahadran trip as an opportunity to give people the chance to do it together, but it's always there, and it's a great place. Secondly, our Siyum. Our Siyum is going to be on January 11th, on Sunday. Okay, even though the last half is really Monday, but we'll do it on Sunday, which makes it a little easier for people to come in on the Zoom. It'll be a Zoom Siyum. We have a great program. Dr. Malko Simkovich is going to be speaking, which about kind of giving us some insight from the Second Temple time period, which will be really interesting. And we're excited. We're going to have a good program. Natalie Taylor is going to be our daf learner who's going to speak. And we'll obviously finish the last daf together. Okay, also, I forgot to mention in class, flashback this week was about the two brothers, Aaron and Moshe. And I think I mentioned the Gefed about the Miriam's leprosy and how that fed into Moshe's status. So there's a bunch of things about that interesting stuff we saw before in yesterday's stuff. Okay, now we're going to get started. The other last announcement I want to make is about today's daf, which is I made a decision, which I don't usually do, but I'm not going to finish the daf today. Okay, I'm leaving the last section. It's just the last section for Shabbat daf on purpose because it's quite complicated, the beginning of Shabbat's daf. And it was a little hard to break it up in the middle, so I just put it into tomorrow's daf completely. So we'll learn the Mishnah, but then immediately the Gemara is going to go off on this contradiction, actually, and this is why I want to mention it now, between the first Mishnah that we're going to start with. We're going to start with the Mishnah and with the Mishnah, and they both seem to contradict each other. Okay? So just so you should know, we're going to basically go from there to there, and then we're going to stop before the Gemara. Okay, Mishnah. Okay, but background before we even start. In Ola, okay, let's just go through very quickly the korbanot, what happens with them. So the Ola, it all gets burnt. And we always think of it, right, Akol Kalil, but we're going to learn today it doesn't really all get burnt. Okay, first of all, we're going to learn at the end of the daf that the bones are actually permitted to benefit from, okay? You don't have to burn the bones. It's the meat that you burn. And what about the hide? Well, there's a pasuk that says in Vayikra chapter 7, verse 8, verse, one second, maybe it's 6, I can't see without my glasses. Okay, chapter 7, verse 8 says, HaKohen hamakriv et olat ish, the Kohen who sacrifices the ola of an ish. Okay, there's a weird language. We're going to talk about this a lot today. The ola of a person. Today we're going to really darshan up this pasuk. Or ha'ola asher ikriv, the hide of that ola that he sacrifices, la kohen lo yiyeh. It goes to the Kohen. Okay, and that's a very simple basic halacha. The hide of the korban ola, it's very basic, but we haven't really discussed it yet. The hide of the korban ola, the burnt offering, which everything gets burnt. No, it doesn't really all get burnt. The hide goes to the kohanim. There's one part of that korban that people can benefit from. Even though we always say it's kalil, it's completely burned. It's not actually completely burnt. The meat is, but not the hide. Okay. Now, if we talk about other korbanot, none of the other korbanot mention what we do with the hide. Okay, so we're going to talk about this later. Let's just quickly review. We have Kodesh Kodeshim, which are Chatat and Asham, guilt and sin offerings. And we'll talk also, we'll add in Shalmei Tzibur, Shlamim, that are communal Shlamim offerings. Those go, what happens with the meat? The meat goes to the Kohen, okay? And we're going to learn soon, okay, in 3 different ways we're going to learn how we get to this, but that the law for Ola, that's only mentioned by Ola, happens to be true also for Shlamim, for Kodesh Kodeshim, for the Shalmei Tzibur, communal Shlamim, for the Asham, and for the Chatat. Then we have Kodeshim Kalim. What happens with Kodeshim Kalim? The owners get the meat, right? Some of the imurim, the fats, get burned on the altar. The meat goes to the owners. And, not surprisingly, the hide also goes to the owner. Okay? Then we're going to see a few exceptions to the rule of a Korban Ola, where actually the temple is going to get the or, and not the Kohanim. And in fact, instead of starting out with the basic halacha, which happens a lot in the Mishnah, we're going to start out with the exception to the rule. When don't the Kohanim get the hide? In what case? So, or sometimes it's going to be the hekdesh, and sometimes it's going to have to be burned. Okay? We're going to talk about a case where it's disqualified, and we're going to have to burn the hide. And actually, this is where the contradiction is going to come in, because our Mishnah is going to mention one thing, that basically when it gets disqualified in this way, the or gets burned and doesn't go to the Kohanim. And the next Mishnah is going to say it depends on something completely different. Okay? If the Mizbeach doesn't merit to have the meat go on the altar, which basically means it gets disqualified, okay, I'm going to say this in much simpler terms, it gets disqualified before the blood was sprinkled. Do you remember we've talked about how the blood is a matir? The blood permits the meat to go on the altar, or the meat to go to the owners, right, in the Shlamim case, or the meat, right? It permits the next stage to happen. Without that, the meat doesn't go on the altar. If you skip the sprinkling of the blood, you can't burn the meat on the altar, on the Ola. So if the meat was never at a stage where it could potentially have gone on the altar, it doesn't have to go on the altar, but it has to be potentially, there was a moment in time where it could theoretically have gone on the altar. If it got disqualified before that, let's say it became tamei, it was pigul, something happened to it, lo zachu kohanim ba'ora. The kohanim don't get the or. Okay, so if the meat could never have gone on the altar, then the or doesn't go to the kohanim. So this Mishnah puts it as, it's the moment of zrikat dam that is the determining factor. Was the disqualification before the blood was sprinkled, or was the disqualification after the blood was sprinkled? Okay, this is a really important, you have to remember this, because for tomorrow's daf, this is going to be critical to understand that. How do we get this? Okay, good question how they get it from the pasuk. I'm going to give you 1 or 2 interpretations. There's many different ones. Shneimar olat ish, ola she'alta leish. Because it says olat ish, which we said was a little strange, the ola of a man, what does it mean, olat ish? Ola, they're darshing the ola. Ola she'alta leish. The ola that went up for someone, or that worked for someone that was, okay, now, what does this mean exactly? So the Rambam says, what does it mean, alta? Went on the altar. Okay, like literally went up. Alta otherwise could be also it was, it worked for the person because the blood was sprinkled. Okay, something like that. Some people darshan the ish, that it was on the fire or could have gone on the fire. It has to do with the fact that you can burn the meat. Okay, different interpretations how they get it, but that's the drasha. So now, what about an ola shenishchata shelo lishma? Now, an ola shenishchata shelo lishma, remember, back to the first Mishnah. If you do an ola for the name of the wrong korban and the sake of the wrong korban, you can bring it anyway on the altar. So that actually could go on the altar. Even though it actually, right, it depends how you really understand al ish. Well, it didn't really work for the ish, but it did work as a korban. So because the kosher korban, ora l'kohanim. So there they do get the or. Achad olata ish v'achad olata isha. Okay, this isn't only true, by the way, that the high goes to the kohen for the ola of a man, even though it says ola of a man, they're trying to tell you it also means ola of a woman. Okay, we're going to have a drasha later in the Gemara. Today's going to be a lot of bright tot about how we get that. So also orotehen l'kohanim. Now we're going to get to the last halach in the Mishnah. Later we're going to see a bright tot where there's 3 different opinions about this. Okay, there's a bit of a reference to one of them here, but there's only one opinion here about. But now we're now going to say this, and this is why I prefaced it by giving you the different types of korbanot. How do we know that this halacha by the ola, even though it only says it about the ola, that the high goes to the kohanim, how do we know it's also true for chatat and asham, and for Kodesh Kodeshim, and it's not true for the Shlamim. So according to our Mishnah, and I wanted to be very specific because we're going to have 3 different ways of getting this. They're all going to say the same thing in the end. Yes, for the Kodesh Kodeshim, not for the Kodeshim Kalim, but they're all going to derive it in 3 different ways. Ora Kodesh Kodeshim l'Kohanim. All Kodesh Kodeshim, the high goes to the Kohanim, not just the Ola as it says in the Pasuk. Kal v'chomer. So according to this Kal v'chomer, we're going to see later this is Rabbi Yishmael's position. Umayim Ola shelo zachu b'bsara zachu ba'ora. Now the Kohanim don't get any part of the meat in the Ola, and yet they get the hide. So Kodesh Kodeshim shezachu b'bsara, and this is why I set it all up for you to remind you of all this, because in the Kodesh Kodeshim they do get the meat. So ein odin she's kuba oran. So if they already get part of it, don't you think they would get the hide as well? If in the Ola they don't get anything, they get the hide. All the more so in case where they do get, they should get the hide. Ein mizbeach yochiach. Okay, now don't try to prove from the mizbeach. Okay, this is a reference to the fact that someone else tried to. Now, what does it mean? Prove. Prove in a kal v'chomer argument usually means prove you're wrong. Don't try to prove I'm wrong from the mizbeach. Okay, now what would be the proof? So let's just go. If we compare the Mizbeach to the Kohen, we say like this. In an Ola, the Mizbeach gets all the meat and yet doesn't get the hide. So what do you see? Getting the meat doesn't necessarily mean you get the hide, because the hide doesn't get burned on the altar, even though the Mizbeach gets the meat. Again, we're using personification of the Mizbeach. So don't try to prove to me, oh, just because you get the meat doesn't mean you get the hide, because look at the Mizbeach, it gets the meat, it doesn't get the hide. And we're going to see later in the Braita that somebody knocked out Rabbi Yishmael's Kal v'chomer for that reason. She'ein lo or b'chol makom, because you never put the hide on the altar, okay? So because it never goes on the altar, that's not a consideration. You can't say, oh, well, it doesn't get the hide even though it gets the meat, and then therefore the Kohanim. It's because the Kohanim get the hide in the Ola case. We know they do. So in a case where they actually get more, like the meat, obviously they're going to get the hide, and the Mizbeach can't disprove my theory. Okay, it's interesting. When someone says, don't say this, it's usually because somebody said it, and in this case, we're going to see explicitly where somebody said it, but you're going to have to wait till much later in the daf. Now we're going to start with a Braita with some drashot. One big drasha is going to take us a long time to figure out what they're talking about. Tanu Rabbanan, Olat Ish. So now we're going to have 2 different things about this, 2 different drashot on the word Olat Ish, which is coming to exclude something. They both agree it's coming to exclude a case where the or is not going to go to the Kohanim. Now, I said this before, but now I'll set it up a little better. In the Mishnah, they're talking about cases where the or doesn't go to the Kohanim because it's disqualified and it gets burned. That was the first case. But now, because, right, just like sacrificial meat gets burned when it's disqualified, also the hide's going to get disqualified again if it was disqualified before the Zrika. If it happened after, then we're going to split it. We're going to say, okay, the meat's disqualified, but the hide is not, because it could have gone on the altar, and that's enough to say it was the Olat Ish, Al Tali Ish. It at least was potentially, right, the blood was sprinkled. Now we're going to say there's cases where it doesn't go to the Kohanim, it goes to the temple. Okay? Now, what are those cases? Or they just don't get it. The truth is, one of these cases could be where they just don't get it. One is going to say it goes to the temple. Olat Ish, prat la Olat Hekdesh. Olat Ish comes to exclude the Ola an Ola that was given to the temple. Okay. What's an Ola that was given to the temple? Now, we always bring the Ola to the temple. No, it's not that, right? When I bring an Ola, it's my Ola. But I can bring an Ola maybe that belongs to the temple. Okay, what that is, we don't know yet. We're going to have 3 different interpretations what that could be. That's Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer prat la Olat Geirim. Olat Ish means the Ola of a person, not a convert. Okay, what? A convert's not a person? Don't worry, the Gemara is going to say that, and the Gemara is going to say that's not what we mean. We'll explain what we mean. Okay, so put that aside, don't get offended. It's not an offensive statement, and the Gemara is going to resolve that. Okay, now, let's just focus first on Olat Hekdesh, then we'll get to the Ger. So my pra la Olat Hekdesh. So first explanation. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Yosef, pra la Olah haba min hamotarot. You might remember the term Kates Mizbeach. Does that ring a bell? That's when you have, let's say, I'm bringing a Korban Asham, a guilt offering, and I lose the animal, and I bring a different animal, and then I find the lost animal. Now, I can't bring it as an Asham because I already brought the second one, okay? Or if the person dies before they bring it, or all sorts of situations. What do you do with that Asham that can't be brought? You redeem it, Okay, there is an opinion that says you can't, because kachataka asham Rabbi Eliezer, remember that? Everything the chat has to die, be left to die. But let's say you hold not. The asham can be redeemed. What you do is you wait till it's blemished and it can't go on the altar anymore. Okay, this can be a big theme. If something can go on the altar, it has to go on the altar. But you can't bring it on the altar because it's an asham. So you wait till it gets a blemish. Once it has a blemish, you sell it. And then you basically take the money and you buy olot for just to have. We want to have olot sacrifices. We want the mikdash to be busy all the time. And those don't belong to anybody, although there's actually a debate about it. Okay, we're going to talk about it right now. Generally, we would think they belong to the temple. So that's a great example of olat of the temple. Okay, so it's the olah that comes from the motarot. That, the hide's going to go to the temple because the whole thing is owned by the temple. It's only when it's owned, now you get why this comes from olat ish. An olah of an individual, not the temple. Okay, privately owned, not temple owned. So, that's if you say that it belongs to the temple. What if you say, though, what about the opinion that says, let's say it was my asham, and I brought an extra one, and then I have nothing to do with it, I redeem it, I bring it as an olah, it belongs to me. I bring it as my own personal olah. So I end up having to bring 2 sacrifices. I brought my asham, and now I have to turn the other asham into an olah. But then it's mine. So wouldn't you think the high would go to the kohanim? Ma'ika lamemer. How are you going to explain it? So kedamar Rava. Now we're going to bring a totally, completely different drasha of Rava, and then we're going to say, you could do copy-paste and say, oh, we're going to say the same thing with our pasuk. So first, let's go out of our topic for a minute. In the pasuk about bringing there's what we call setting up the 2 eitzim every day on the ma'aracha, and then you would bring the korban tamid on that. Now the pasuk says, "Ha'esh al mizbeach tukab lo tichbeh." You always leave the fire on the pyre. Ubi'er ala kohen eitzim baboker, and the kohen brings eitzim every morning. Va'arach aleha ha'olah, and he puts on it the olah. How do you know? The olah has to come first. The korban tamid has to come first. Now we learned already tadir v'sheino tadir kodem. But from this pasuk, they learn that the one that goes first has to be the korban tamid because it says ha'olah olah rishona. It's the olah. That one goes first. Okay, the special one. The tamid is always the special korban. That's the one that goes first. Okay, so what does that have to do with us? Well, our pasuk says a kohen makriv olat ish, right? The kohen who does the olah of a person, of a man, or ha'olah goes to the kohen, the or of the olah. Now, what do we learn from here? Hachanami ha'olah olah rishona. What does olah rishona here mean? It means something completely different than the other one. But what it means is you need the original olah, not an olah that was a leftover asham that turned into an olah. Or, by the way, there's other motarot. We're going to talk about some other motarot later. But it's something that morphed into an olah. It wasn't an olah originally. Only an original olah does the or go to the kohen. And that's the second way of explaining it. But anyway, both of these are the first explanation of olat hekdesh, that it came from an olah that came from a motar, from leftovers. Rabbi Aivu, Amar Rabbi Yanai, and then again, it's owned by the temple, or we say it's just not an original olah. Those are the 2 ways of reading it. Okay. Next, Rabbi Aivu, Amar Rabbi Yanai, prat lematpis olah lebedek habayit. Okay, for this you need some background. Just I can bring things to the temple and say this is sanctified for the altar. That's usually animals and things that can go on the altar. Or I can say this is sanctified for bedek habayit, for temple maintenance. So that means its value really is sanctified, not the object itself. The main big difference is I can redeem that. If the animal, I can't redeem it. That was the whole reason why we just said, I can't just redeem it. I have to wait till it's blemished and it can't go on the altar anymore, and then I can redeem it. Okay, that's a big difference between what we call kedushat haguf, the body itself is sanctified, rather than kedushat damim. Kedushat damim and kedushat haguf basically are parallel to kedushat bedek habayit and kedushat mizbeach. Mizbeach is kedushat haguf, and bedek habayit is kedushat damim. Okay, has its only value. Now, what if I sanctify? In this case, sorry, I'll just find my place again. Matpis olah lebedek habayit. Now, if I say I'm bringing an olah for the temple maintenance, okay, now what does that mean? It's a very odd statement because if I'm bringing an olah, it's a sacrifice. If I bring bedek habayit, it's temple maintenance. So what exactly does this mean? So now there's a big debate about whether konshe bedek habayit or tofes, in this case by Torah law or not. Because if we say kicks in Kedushat Mizbeach right away, if it's right, like I'm bringing an animal and I say, this is Ola for Bedek HaBayit, we ignore my Bedek HaBayit because it goes straight to the Mizbeach and there is no Kedushat Bedek HaBayit. That's one way of seeing it. It's immediately Kodshe Mizbeach. Okay? Another way is saying, no, there is some meaning to Bedek HaBayit here, even though it's got Kedushat Mizbeach. So those are the two options. So now we're going to say, you don't even need to explain yourself according to the fact that you say Kodshe Bedek HaBayit Tafse Midoraita. It really does belong to the temple maintenance. What does that mean basically? That the korban is a korban that belongs to the temple. I'm basically saying I'm bringing a korban on behalf of the temple maintenance. So that means that any part that's left of this korban goes to the temple maintenance, like the or. And that's why the kohanim won't get it. That's why it's very obvious and intuitive in this case. Because if you say that the Bedek HaBayit can actually have ownership rights to this, so then they do. Perfect. Afilu l'man damar lo tafse. Now, if you say, if something has Kedushat Mizbeach, then there's no Bedek HaBayit. You can't give that over to the temple and immediately go straight to the Mizbeach because it's ra'oi for the Mizbeach. But let's just think for a minute. What part of the Ola is ra'oi for the Mizbeach? The meat, not the or. So even if you say that when something's Kedushat Mizbeach, it can't be owned by the temple, hanimile basal. That owes only the meat. Aval or tafis. But the or, since the or is not going to go on the altar, actually the Bedek HaBayit can kick in there, even on a Torah level. So either which way now, we're going to explain that the or is going to go to the Bedek HaBayit. Either they become the complete owners of it, or they're not really the complete owners, but they do own any part that doesn't go on the altar, which would be the or. V'chein amar Rav Nachman. And the first option is I'm just really transferring rights to Bedek HaBayit. I'm saying I'm bringing this korban, but I'm giving it to the Bedek HaBayit, and then they become complete owners. And then again, then it's not an Olad Ish because it's owned by the Hekdesh. But if you say you can't do that, well, you can't do that for the meat, but you can do it for the part that's not going to go on the altar anyway. Okay, now the v'chein is a little tricky. V'chein means and such said, but it's actually going back to the first interpretation. V'chein amar Rav Nachman amar Rav Avua prat lo ola ba'amin motorot. Okay, I said there's three explanations, but right now we only have two. We have number one, it's ola that comes from motar, from leftovers. The second is it's an ola that I gave to the Bedek HaBayit. And then we explained, right, both were explained even according to two different interpretations. Now, also the third one's going to be different interpretations, but it's actually only going to be able to explain according to one, okay? Whereas these were all able to explain according to all interpretations. So now comes Rav Nachman in the name of Rav Avua, and he says, Prat lo la ba'amin motorot. He says like the first person, like Rabbi Chia bar Yosef. But Amar Rav Hamnuna le Rav Nachman, Kiman, ki Rabbi Yehuda. Wait, are you saying this like Rabbi Yehuda? Because Rabbi Yehuda actually says this somewhere. Now remember, we're trying to explain Rabbi Yehuda. He says, Ha-hadarbe. Rabbi Yehuda actually thought this originally and then changed his mind about it. How do we know? Well, let's read the following Braita. Titanya, Shisha lenidava. Okay, there were 13 like stucco boxes. Okay, they were shofarot. They were in the shape of a shofar in the temple. If you remember, we learned this in Shkalim. We've seen it in other places as well. I think it comes up in Yoma. And 6 of them were used. Obviously, there were a lot of these for motarot. Okay, for all sorts of motarot. Like let's say another case of motal leftover. I take 100 shekel to buy a chat, an animal for a sin offering, and then I find a cheaper one for 90, and I'm left with 10. But I already designated that money for the chatat. I put the extra money in this box. Okay, now what do they do with the box? They use it for ketz hamizbeach, for extra olot. So shelo yehu kohanim zakeim ba'ora. Now the shin is different, not the typical shin here. In those cases, not so that, it's in those cases the kohanim don't get the or, okay? All the sacrifices they used with these olot that they were buying, that were from the money they took from here, the kohanim don't get the or. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So basically, what do you see there? Rabbi Yehuda holds it's from the motar. It's the same thing as the first interpretation. But we're going to see in a minute, or at least they think, that he changes his mind. Why are we going to see he change his mind? Because Rabbi Nechemya, or maybe Rabbi Shimon, they're not sure who, came with a question against him, and he doesn't respond. So from the fact that he doesn't respond, we assume he changes his mind. And then we're going to say, okay, so that knocks out that interpretation. So Rav Hamnuna says to Rav Nachman, how can you say it's the motar? Rabbi Yehuda himself changed his mind. You're trying to understand Rabbi Yehuda. Amar lo Rabbi Nechemya v'amar la Rabbi Shimon. Because remember, Rabbi Yehuda was the one who said in the beginning, pra lo la hekdesh. So now he says, imken, bitalta midrasho shel Yehuda Kohen. If you go with that interpretation, you basically knocked out this interpretation, Yehuda Kohen. Why? Tanya zeh midrash darash Yehoyada Kohen. Asham asham laHashem. It's a strange pasuk. It says the asham is laHashem. What do you mean? The asham is for the owner, right? And the meat goes to the kohanim. What do you mean it's for Hashem? It's not for Hashem, right? Only a bit of it gets burnt on the altar. Kol sheba mishum chatat umishum asham yilakach bo olot habasar laHashem ora lakohanim. What this means is you could have a case where the asham becomes to God. What would that be? And how is it also the kohen? Well, if the asham is left over, like we saw, either you have extra money from it or you bought an extra one, right? Then what do? You take the money, let's say there's extra money because you were going to buy an asham with X amount of money and you had extra money left over. The extra money you buy olot, and that asham can morph into an olah. And in that case, the basar will go to God and the or to kohanim. So now, what do you see here? In a case of motar, the or goes to the kohanim. So that completely contradicts what Rabbi Yehuda said. So Amar Le, so Rav Nachman now, we're back to Rav Nachman. We're out of the Braita. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't respond. We assume he changed his mind. So Rav Nachman says to him, okay, Alamar b'may mokim la. So how do you explain, Rabbi Yehuda? Fine, you're rejecting my interpretation, but what's yours? And now we're going to get to the third. Amar Le mukmin ale b'makdish nechasav. Now getting back to this Kedushat Mizbeach issue. What if I say all my property is sanctified to the temple? Now normally when you say that, what you mean is for Bedek HaBayit, okay? Because you can't bring everything in your house on the altar. So you mean the Bedek HaBayit. And what's the problem? The problem is, if I have animals that can go on the altar, so what do we do with them? Because if I meant Bedek HaBayit, then we can't exactly bring them on the altar. But if Kedushat Mizbeach kicks in, then they have to go on the altar, so we're kind of stuck. So now we're going to say, and this I told you already about before, but now you'll see it, Uchid Rabbi Yoshua. Now you're only going to be able to explain this case if you go with Rabbi Yoshua's interpretation of what you do in this case. There's a machloket what you do. First we're going to see the other opinion, then we'll see Rabbi Yoshua, and then you're going to see that the or is going to go, right, is not going to go to the kohanim in that case. So now, first interpretation, Ditznan. HaMakdish nechasav ayu b'hem be'emot haruyot legabei mizbeach scharim u'nikevot. So you sanctify everything you own. And among them, you have male and female animals that are perfectly, unblemished animals that can go on the altar. So what do you do with them? Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Zcharim, now you have to remember, or maybe you don't know this, an olah can only come from a male animal. So the ideal would be to bring them all as olot, because olot are all to God, and you basically sanctify this all to God. Right? You're not going to want to bring it as a shlamim goes to you. Okay? But there's another problem, which is according to the first interpretation, you said it's Bedek HaBayit. You can't start splitting that and do some on the altar, some Bedek HaBayit. You said the whole thing was for temple maintenance. So what you're going to have to do is, you're going to have to somehow get those animals on the altar, because you did sanctify them and they have to go on the altar, but not directly because they're directly belonging to the temple. So what do? Our classic solution. In the end, we need that animal to go on the altar. But on the other end, you gave it to Bedek HaBayit. So what do? You wait till it gets some blemish. You redeem it, because you can't redeem it directly, because it's Kedushat Mizbeach. But what you do is, you sell it to someone, since it has to go on the altar, you can't redeem the Kedusha. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. You don't wait till it gets a blemish. My mistake. You sell it directly, immediately, to someone who can bring it as a Korban Olah. And then the animal gets on the altar, which is perfect. That's what we need. And the money goes to the temple maintenance from the sale. Okay? So you sell them to people who need olot. Nikevot, now the females you can't do that with. But the females, what were they sanctified for? Well, the basic, right, the only other nidava you could do is a shlamim. So the nikevot, yimachru l'tzorchei shlamim. So you sell those for shlamim. Shlamim could be male or female. But if you sanctify them, we'd rather, right, we're going to always go with the more chamor, but we don't know since you didn't specify. So we're going to do the olah, right, first, for the ones we could do the olah for. The nekeva, you sell to someone who needs a shlamim. And then what do you do with the money? Very simple. Demeim yiplum shar nechasim lebedek habayit. And then the money goes to temple maintenance. Very simple. Okay, so the animals get dealt with if they end up on the altar, because you sold them to someone, and the money goes to bedek habayit. That's because this interpretation holds. When you say all manichasim, it has to all go to one place, Bedek HaBayit. But Rabbi Yoshua Omer, what do you mean? Scharim atzmam yikravu olot. He's got a problem, because he says the scharim you could do as olot. But Nikevot, now he says you could just sacrifice them as Ola, because he says, okay, I said everything's sanctified, and normally we say Bedek Habayit, but you can't say Bedek Habayit for animals. Animals immediately go to the Mizbeach. So I could just bring the animals, and as I said, all my stuff, I meant some go to Bedek Habayit, some go to the altar. What can go on the altar goes on the altar, and the Scharim are the easiest because they're going to go completely on the altar, which is fine because they go completely to God. Now, this is Rabbi Yoshua. Now we get to our case. What happens to the Or? Well, I sanctified it all to the temple, so it's not going to go to the Kohanim because I said everything's going to the temple. So that means my whole Ola is going to the temple, both the meat, which will go on the altar, and the hide, which will go to the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? It's not going to go to the Kohanim. Okay? And that's the exception. That's already our answer. What do you do with the Nikevot? Nikevot are more tricky, because Nikevot, if they go with Shlamim, I'm going to end up with the meat, right? It's not going to end up the altars. So Nikevot yimachru l'tzorchei Shlamim, udmehem yiplum shar nechasim lebedek habayit. So I just read the wrong thing. Nikevot yimachru l'tzorchei Shlamim, v'yavi b'demehem olot. We want to turn them into olot, basically. So what do? Well, the animal basically can't be an olah. So you sell it to someone who's doing a korban shlamim. You take the money and you bring it as an olah, and that way everything can be an olah. You just have to turn it over to have it be an olah. Ushar nechasim. What do you do with the rest of the money? Whatever else I own, obviously, yiplu lebedek habayit. And now they say, and afilu leRabbi Yoshua da'amar adam cholek hekdesho, and even according to Rabbi Yoshua, who says you can split your hekdesh, right? Some could be bedek habayit, some could be mizbeach. Hanimi lebasar. Aval or tafis. That's the basar. But the or, why does the or end up to Bedek Habayit? Because what he's basically saying is, when I said this is all to the temple, whatever had Kedushat Mizbeach has Kedushat Mizbeach, but the or never had Kedushat Mizbeach, and therefore it just goes straight to Bedek Habayit, and that's why the Kohanim don't get the or, because the or is already, like from the get-go, going straight to Bedek Habayit. Okay, so that's the end of this section of what this exception to the rule is prat lo'olat hekdesh. Either an olah that comes from the motar, or matbis olah lebedek habayit. You said this olah belongs to the temple, or you sanctify all your property, among them were animals. Then also the hide of the olah don't go to the bedek habayit. Don't go to the kohanim. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer prat lo'olat gerim. So here comes our good question. Amalei Rabbi Simai brachai lechavina. Atu ger lav ishu. What, a ger is not a man? Of course a ger is a person. What do you mean? Amarle. Prat leger shemei be'en lo yorshim. We're talking about a specific situation with a ger. What it meant is, okay, if a ger, right, obviously the ger brings an olah, it's going to be the same as anybody else, this convert. But a convert, what's unique about a convert? They're like a katan shenolad. So anyone who was related to them before is no longer related to them. They have no relatives unless they have children after they convert. So, if they have no children, then they have no other heirs. Every other Jew has someone who's connected somewhere, as distant as it could be. But the ger has no relatives. So what happens? So the problem is that it doesn't belong to an... Now, what if the ger designated korban olah and then died? So this olah has to be brought, but there's no owner to it. So that's not an olad ish. It's missing an owner. That's the point. And then the Kohen's not going to get it because he only gets if it's an owner. What happens to it? Good question. So there's a few different options. Either it goes to Bedek Habayit, or it could be hefker. Most of their stuff is hefker, and anyone could actually take it. And there's a third option about they sell it and they buy with it mincha and nisachim and libations for the temple. Okay, now we're going to move on. Tanu Rabbanan, Olat Ish. Okay, now we're going to have a braita. The main purpose of bringing this braita is to basically show the source and delve into a little bit the halachot in the Mishnah. So we had, the first one we had was also a man, also a woman. We're going to see where we get that from. Olat Ish, and li'alo Olat Ish. It sounds like Olah of a man. Where do we get a woman? And also... Olat gerim. Actually, they get rid of the word gerim in most of the nuschaot. Olat nashim ba'avadim minayin. Where do you get also women and slaves? Talmud Lomar or ha'olah. We're going to see this a bunch of times, and I don't know why they don't relate to how are we learning a million things from this pasuk. But or ha'olah is going to be the or of the olah is going to be a phrase that they say comes to include other things. Okay, because they repeat olah. It said olah before, now it says olah again. Must be adding another thing. So that's including women. Imke matam lomar olat ish. So why does it say olat ish? Olah sha'al tali ish. And that's already what we saw, right? It's an olah that went for a man. Pra l'shenishchata chutz l'zmana chutz l'koma. Other than, let's say, pigul. If it was disqualified, It's not going to work. That was the first halacha in our Mishnah. Shelo yu kohanim zakeim ba'ora, right? In that case, the kohanim don't get the hide. Yachol shani marbeh. Now, if you're going to disqualify, this is basically learning of a Mishnah with the transition that was missing to the lo lishma. Just kind of said it without the transition. Once you disqualify, you say disqualified offerings don't work. Well, maybe, and it has to be al ish. Maybe yachol shani marbeh shenishchatash lo lishma. Maybe it wasn't if it was shelo lishma. Shehoil v'lo al ba'alim, since it wasn't valid for that person, turning out amabet, lo yu kohanim zakeim ba'ora. Maybe the kohanim don't get the hide. Talmud lomar, or ha'olah mikol makom. Second inclusion here from the same words, or ha'olah comes to include another case, even shelo lishma, because it is a valid korban. Or ha'olah, ein li ela or ha'olah. Now we're going to get to the three drashot I promised you about the koche koche. Ein li ela or ha'olah. Oro koche koche minayin. How do we know koche kochim are included as well? That the or goes to the kohanim. Talmud lomar, or ha'olah asher hikriv. Okay, the words asher hikriv come to include. Now here, notice, in our Mishnah, it was a kal v'chomer. Here we're getting to our second. It's a drasha. It says asher hikriv. Why does it say asher hikriv? Obviously, it's asher hikriv, and ola gets sacrificed. Why do you say that was sacrificed? That's to include other sacrifices as well. Well, if you're already including other sacrifices, well, yachol. Now, in the Mishnah, we didn't need to say why not kochim kalim, because it's only kochim kochim that the meat goes to the kohen, they get the hide as well. When the meat goes to the owners, right, it makes sense not to think that the kohen's going to get it, but or to think right that the kohen's not going to get it. But yachol shani marbe'av kochim kalim. Once you say asher hikriv, maybe it includes all korbanot. Talmud lomar ola ma ola kochim kochim av kol kochim kochim. It has to be at least similar to ola. Ola, right, is the highest sanctity, but Chatan and Nashim are not far behind. They're all kochim kochim. We're only going to include those. We're not going to include kochim kalim. That's interpretation number one. Now we're going to go to interpretation number two, which is the one we saw in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, or ha'olah, and li'ala ha'olah. This is just going to be a repeat. Or ro kochim kochim minayin. How do you know also kochim kochim? Vidinhu, it's kal v'chomer logic. Uma olah shelo zachu b'bsara zachu ba'ora. Just like in an olah, they don't get the meat, and yet they get the hide. Kochim kochim shezachu b'bsara einu din shezachu ba'ora. So kochim kochim, where they get the meat, the chatan yashon, the meat goes to the kohen, and shalmei tzibur, right, communal shlamim. Wouldn't you say obviously they would get the or? So here comes the mizbeach yochiach. Now here you have it. Instead of him saying don't say this, now you have the counter argument. Mizbeach yochiach. What do you mean? The altar will knock out your kal v'chomer and say shezacha b'basar v'lo zacha b'or. It gets the meat, it doesn't get the hide. So kohanim the same. You know, you could say they get the meat, but they don't necessarily get the hide in the kochim in the chatan nashim kochim. No, because ma'ale mizbeach shekain lo zacha b'miktzat. Tomar b'kohanim shezachu b'miktzat. Ho'il v'zachu b'miktzat zachu b'kulan. The mizbeach didn't ever get anything. They never get the or. The kohanim do get some of the or where in an olah case. So we'll assume if they get in the olah case, they're going to get it here as well, where it's all the more likely they would get it because they already get the meat. Third interpretation. Now, Rebbe's basically going to say a whole completely different outlook. Not that we need a pasuk for it, not that we need a logical argument for it. We don't need any reason to prove it because it's just obvious. And the only case it's not obvious is the olah, and that's why the pasuk told us by olah. Very interesting way of reading it. Kol atzmo lo, Rebbe Omer, kol atzmo lo tzrachnu elel or holah b'vad. The only reason we needed the pasuk was for the olah. We don't need to learn from the olah to everything else. That was the standalone. Why? Because in every other situation, the or has the exact same law as the meat. It's just intuitive. Or, right, the or is the hide of the meat. Whatever's true for the meat is true for the or. Okay, let's go through. Parim and Israfim, Visirim and Israfim. We're going to talk about them a lot tomorrow. Okay, these are the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, right? The seir and the par that he brings, and the par and the davar shel tzibur, and all those things we learned. They, remember, they get burnt outside the temple. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Hein v'orotehem nisrafim imahem. They get completely burned together. The whole thing. The or with the basar. Chataf yasham v'zivchei shalmei tzibur. Matana lekohen. Chatan nasham and shalmei tzibur, the meat. Yeah, meat includes the hide. Everything goes to the kohen. Ratzu mafshitin otam. If they want, they can take the hide off before they cook the meat. Lo ratzu ochlin otam agav aran. If they don't want, they can eat the meat with the hide on it, eat around the hide, and be left with the hide at the end. In other words, the kohen has rights to do whatever he wants. It's all one thing. Kodshim kalim labalim. Same thing for the balim. And the kodshim kalim, the meat goes to the balim, also the hide goes to the balim. Same thing as the kohanim. They could decide they want to take the hide off, separate. They could decide before they cook. They could decide they want to cook it with the hide and then just eat around it. Okay. Aval ola, but what's the problem with the ola? Why do you need a special pasuk? Because it says, now you're going to understand why they said you could flay it, you don't have to flay it, because specifically by the ola, what does it say? First you take off the hide, then and then you cut it up into pieces and put the pieces on the altar. So you've already separated the hide, and it's already a different thing, and it doesn't get burned. So that's why you need, you might not have thought the kohanim would get it, like you wouldn't know what to do with it. Talmud lomar, or ha'olah sheri kriv lo yihiyeh. And that's why you need or ha'olah sheri kriv, and then, the continuation, which is lo yihiyeh, right? It goes to the kohen. Now we're going to have another drasha. Okay, this is just the end of the Braita. So we finished that part of the Braita of the three interpretations of how we get kodshim yes and kodshim kalim no. Lo yihiyeh, prat l'tful yomim v'chusar kipurim v'onein. It goes to him. This you don't really need it. I said lakohen. Why do you have to say lo yihiyeh? It's unnecessary. Well, it's to tell you, it goes to him, but not to someone else who can't get it. You don't get the hide if you're a tful yom, v'chusar kipurim and onein. All those people who can't get parts of sacrificial meat, you also don't get the hide. You might have thought, well, they don't get the meat because it's supposed to be eaten. But maybe maybe you would get the meat, the hide, because it doesn't get eaten, right? The whole problem is they can't eat, but maybe they could get the hide. That's why we need a special drasha to exclude them. Okay, done with the Braita. Now we're going to go back to the three interpretations. We're going to have a bit of a question. Tanakama, Nami Tepukle Medina. Why did the Tanakama take Rabbi Yishmael's Kavachomer? Why do you need a drasha? So this is very common, they say. Milta da'ati b'Kavachomer, Tarach HaChatav Lakra. Sometimes you learn something about Kavachomer, and you could just learn it from a Kavachomer, but if you have a pasuk, it's even stronger. So sometimes, even though you have a Kavachomer, we'd rather print it from a pasuk if we have the choice. It's not that you disagree with this Kavachomer. Rabbi Yishmael, Haya Sheri Kriv my Avidle. Now remember, a Sheri Kriv came to include the Kodesh HaKodeshim. He didn't need it. So that was the Tanakama's drasha. So what does he do with the words Asheri Kriv? Prat l'tful yom m'chusar kipurim va'onein. Okay, now we're going to say he comes to include the exact halacha we already excluded from lo yihiyeh. We're going to ask that in a minute. But he says it comes to Asheri Kriv only if you sacrificed it. If you didn't sacrifice it because you couldn't, because you were an onein, t'ful yom, m'chusar kipurim, with those categories, then you can't. Okay? Now, then you don't get a portion. So they ask him, typically lo tiyeh. What do you mean? The end of the Braita darshaned it from lo yihiyeh. Why didn't he darshan it from there? And now we're going to end by basically saying, Rabbi Yishmael uses lo yihiyeh for a completely different drasha. Okay? And it's not free for him to do this. Rabbi Yishmael l'tameh, he goes according to his own shita, because he says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, it said that Rabbi Yochanan said this in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. Ne'amar ba'olah lo yihiyeh, and ne'amar ba'asham lo yihiyeh. We're going to make a gzera shava between the asham and the olah. Both say lo yihiyeh. Ma lahalan atzmotav mutarin. I mentioned this before. Just like in the asham, the bones are permitted to the kohen to benefit from. Also, afkan, also in the olah, atzmotav mutarin. Now, is this logical? No, it's not. Because you could say, what do you mean? The asham, the meat goes to the kohen. That makes sense why he can benefit. The olah lo. And that's why the Gemara has to tell us, mufne. Those words, lo yihiyeh, are really unnecessary, because remember the rules with Gzera Shava? If the words are unnecessary, you can darshan anything you want. If they're necessary, but you also want to make a Gzera Shava on them, it'll work as long as you don't have a difficulty on the Gzera Shava. But here we have a difficulty. So it must be the words are free, mufne, they're unnecessary, right? They were extra words, basically, di'ilo mufne, because if they weren't free, we can knock this out and say, well, the meat is permitted, so that's why the bones are permitted. But we can't say the same for the olah. But therefore, they say lo yihiyeh krayateru. Yeah, it's really a totally extra extra words. We don't really need it, and that's why we could darshan the Gzera Shava. So that's why he doesn't learn lo yihiyeh, and he uses the Asheri Kriv for the lo yihiyeh. And with that, we finish the back and forth. Why each one didn't hold like the other. Now we're going to start the new Mishnah. We're going to learn this Mishnah, and as I said, we're going to end here, and the Gemara we're going to get to in tomorrow's daf. Kol HaKodeshim shira b'em. Okay, remember the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah said, what determines when does it get disqualified? If it's disqualified before the blood is sprinkled, then the or never got permitted to the kohanim, so they don't get it. If it got disqualified after the blood went on, then it was already, the meat was theoretically able to be put on the altar, and that's enough to say, okay, well, now the meat's disqualified, we're going to burn the meat, but the or goes to the kohanim. But this Mishnah says a different issue is about the determining factor. It's all about hefshed. Hefshed is what we talked about when you flay the skin, flay the hide. If first it got disqualified when the animal was one complete unit, meaning the hide was attached. So if it gets disqualified at that moment, so the or is part of the meat. It's disqualified, the whole thing has to be burnt. But it's as if you flayed the meat and then it got disqualified, then the hide is already completely separate. When the meat gets disqualified, the meat's disqualified. That gets burned, the hide doesn't. So this is a complete contradiction to the previous, because one is saying it's all about when was it separated, and the other one said was the blood sprinkled or not? Two completely different things. So we're going to have to deal with that, and each one we're going to see matches a completely different Tana's opinion. And then it's super confusing. What? This Mishnah matches that matches that. That's going to be the beginning of tomorrow's stuff. Amar Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Okay, he's somebody who talks about the temple a lot because he was in the temple, and he says, Mi amai lo reiti or sheyatzah lebeit hasreifa. You're saying if it was attached to the meat, when the meat got disqualified, they would have to burn the hide. I've never seen them burn the hide before in the temple. Okay, the Gemara is going to ask 4 difficulties on this. Okay, what do you mean? What about this case? What about that case? Oh, he wasn't referring to that. Oh, okay, but I've never seen them. What he really means is I've never seen them flay the hides, burn the hide separately. Like it was somehow separate and burned it. Never seen them burn the hide ever. And therefore you must be wrong. Amar Rabbi Akiva, and tomorrow we'll also discuss what's he doing from this. Midvarav lamanu, what's Rabbi Akiva trying to add here? Midvarav lamanu shamafshitet habachor v'nimtzat chefa she'otu kohanim ba'oro. Okay, the simple reading of this tomorrow we'll explain a little differently, or in Shabbos and stuff. But from the fact that he says you don't burn the hide ever, you can learn that if you're mafshit et habachor, if you flay a firstborn, and then nimtzat trefa, since it was separated, and then it became a trefa, she'otu kohanim ba'oro. The kohanim can benefit from the or, because we don't burn the hide. So even though it was a trefa to begin with, we don't burn the hide anyway. V'chachamim omrim, okay, now chachamim respond to Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Ein lo ra'inu ra'aya. The fact that you never saw them burn the hide is not a proof. Just because they never burned it doesn't mean it's not a law. That's not a kind of way of proving things. Ella, right? Maybe if I did see something, but saying I never saw it doesn't prove anything. Ella yitzeh lebeit hasreifa. It would get burned if it got disqualified together with the meat, and then was, let's say, flayed separately. You would burn it. Okay, we're going to stop here. I'm going to review very quickly. We started with some laws about when the hide doesn't go to the kohanim, when it does go to the kohanim, right? What also in Kodesh HaKodeshim it goes to the kohanim. In the end, we had 2 exceptions to the rule. Not the Olah Hekdesh or not the Olah Gerim. We had 3 interpretations what Olah Hekdesh is. We have one that we had to interpret what this Olah Gerim exceptional case is. Then we brought a braita that had all the drashot that were the basis for the halachot in the Mishnah about the woman was included, the fact that the Kodesh HaKodeshim, we had 3 different opinions there about how we learn the Kodesh HaKodeshim or the or goes to the kohanim as well, and not in Kodeshim Kalim. And then we ended with this other Mishnah about how hefshed plays a role here, and then we're going to have to deal with that compared to the previous Mishnah. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.